I signed their prenup with a smile on my face, and then I pulled out mine, the one that listed my billion-dollar inheritance from Chen Global Technologies. I know what you're thinking. How does someone hide being a billionaire? Easy. You drive a used Honda, live in a cramped Oakland apartment, and never ever mention that your grandfather founded one of the largest tech conglomerates in the world. My name is Nora, and I spent a year dating Drew Ashford without telling him, or anyone, that I was worth more than most people see in 10 lifetimes. It wasn't about playing games. It was about knowing if someone loved me for me, not for the Chen family name that appears on NASDAQ tickers and Fortune 500 lists. Drew was perfect, smart, kind, funny. He worked in venture capital, made a decent living, and treated me like I mattered. His family, though? That was a different story. The Ashfords had money, maybe $40 million in real estate investments, and his mother, Victoria, acted like they were American royalty. From the first time we met, she looked at me like I was dirt on her designer shoes. My simple clothes, my modest car, my small apartment, it all screamed gold digger to her, I guess. 2 weeks before my wedding, Victoria called me to her house in Atherton for what she called tea. Drew was traveling. When I walked into that pristine living room, I found Victoria, her husband George, and their family attorney waiting for me like a firing squad. They wanted me to sign a prenup, and not just any prenup, one that would leave me with absolutely nothing if Drew and I ever divorced. No house, no money, nothing. There was even a clause that made me responsible for any improper behavior, while saying nothing about Drew, like I was the untrustworthy one. Victoria leaned back in her chair, practically glowing with smugness, and told me I wasn't bringing anything significant to the marriage, that it was only fair they protected what was theirs. Then she gave me the ultimatum: sign it or leave Drew. I looked at that woman who thought she had all the power, and I picked up the pen. I signed every single page while she smiled like she'd just won the lottery. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope. This is a long and painful story. Well, painful for Victoria, at least. And I need someone to witness how it all unfolded. If you want to see what happened when I revealed who I really was, make sure you're following along here so you don't miss what comes next. The look on Victoria's face when I told her I had my own prenup is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. She actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle, a full, condescending laugh that filled that enormous living room. She thought I was joking. This woman, who had just spent 20 minutes explaining why I was essentially worthless, couldn't fathom that I might have something worth protecting. I slid the envelope across her mahogany coffee table, the one she'd bragged cost $15,000 at some estate sale in Napa. My hands were steady, but my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was it, the moment I'd been avoiding for a year. Victoria picked up the envelope like it might be contaminated, that same smug smile still plastered on her face. She pulled out the document, and I watched her eyes scan the first page, then the second, then back to the first, like she'd misread something. The smile vanished. Her face went from rosy and triumphant to pale, almost gray. George leaned over to look, and I saw his mouth literally fall open. Their attorney, some guy named Robert who'd been silent this whole time, suddenly sat up straighter, his professional composure cracking. I let the silence stretch. Let them read. Let them absorb what they were seeing. My prenup wasn't complicated. It just listed the facts. 15% ownership stake in Chen Global Technologies, currently valued at approximately $2 billion. Additional trust funds worth $340 million. Properties in San Francisco, New York, London, and Hong Kong. Investment portfolios. The numbers went on. Victoria's hand started shaking. Actually shaking. The papers rustled in her grip. George was the first to speak, his voice coming out strangled and hoarse. He asked if it was real, and I could see he was hoping, praying maybe, that this was some kind of elaborate prank. I told them it was very real, that they could verify it themselves. Chen Global Technologies, trading under CGT on the NASDAQ, currently at $247 per share. I said it so calmly, like I was discussing the weather. But inside, I was vibrating. Not with anger exactly. More like the feeling you get right before a storm hits, when the air gets electric and everything goes quiet. Victoria looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd met her, she actually saw me. Not the girl in discount jeans she could dismiss. Not the nobody from Oakland she could intimidate. She saw someone who could, if I wanted to, buy her husband's entire company with what amounted to pocket change. She asked if I was really a Chen, from Chen Global. Her voice cracked on my family name. I confirmed it. Granddaughter of the founder, daughter of the current CEO. And then I told her why I'd never mentioned it, because I didn't like mixing family business with personal relationships. Because I wanted to be sure Drew loved me for who I was, not for what my last name represented in boardrooms across the world. The room felt airless. George kept staring at the document like it might change if he looked long enough. Robert, the attorney, had gone completely silent, probably mentally calculating how badly his clients had just screwed up. I turned to Robert and explained my prenup. It was straightforward, I told him. In case of divorce, each person keeps their premarital assets. Anything acquired during the marriage gets split fairly. No punitive clauses. No confidentiality agreements about abuse. Just fair treatment for both people. That's when Victoria tried to recover. She started to say they didn't know, that they had no idea, her voice trembling with something between humiliation and panic. I cut her off. I told her she didn't know because she'd judged me based on appearances. That she'd seen my modest car and small apartment and assumed I was nothing. That she'd decided I was a gold digger after her family's money. Money that was laughable compared to what I already had. George attempted to explain their position, to justify what they'd done. His face was red now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. But I wasn't interested in their excuses. I told them I understood perfectly. I understood they'd insulted me, belittled me, tried to intimidate me. I understood they'd made me sign a prenup that would leave me destitute, while I could easily buy their entire family business with a fraction of my stock holdings. Victoria started crying. Not real tears. I could tell the difference. These were tears of embarrassment, of social humiliation. She apologized, said they didn't mean to offend me. But here's the thing that really cracked something open in that room. I told her they absolutely did mean to offend me. They just never expected I'd have the power to fight back. I pushed my prenup back across that expensive coffee table and told them I wouldn't make them sign it. The relief that washed over Victoria's face was almost funny. She thought I was backing down, being reasonable, letting her off the hook. George actually exhaled like he'd been holding his breath underwater. But I wasn't done. I told them I wouldn't make them sign it because, unlike them, I didn't need to control or diminish my partner through legal contracts. I trusted Drew, and when we got married, it would be based on love and respect, not greed and fear. Then I picked up their prenup, the one I'd just signed, and I tore it in half. Right there in front of them, the sound of paper ripping was the only noise in that silent room. Victoria's eyes went wide. George looked like he might pass out. I told them they could keep their insulting protection, that I didn't need it. But I wanted them to remember this moment, to remember how badly they'd misjudged me, how they'd almost lost the best thing that would ever happen to their family. I walked out of that house with my head high, my purse over my shoulder, leaving them sitting there in their shock and humiliation. I didn't look back. The drive home was a blur. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from adrenaline. I'd just detonated a bomb in the middle of the Ashford family, and I had no idea what the fallout would be. Drew called me that night. He was still in Chicago, and I could hear the confusion in his voice before he even spoke. He said his mother had just called him, hysterical, barely making sense. He asked what happened. I told him everything. The ambush, the prenup, their demands, my revelation. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. So long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Drew asked if I was really a billionaire. His voice was quiet, careful. I explained that technically my family was, that I had access to substantial funds and would eventually inherit more. But yes, the numbers were real. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading. Why had I never told him? My throat tightened. I told him the truth, that I wanted him to love me for me, not for Chen Global, not for the money, just for Nora. The woman who liked terrible reality TV and burned toast and laughed too loud at bad jokes. Drew sighed, and I held my breath. Then he said something that made my eyes sting with tears. He said he would love me whether I was a billionaire or completely broke. That it didn't change anything about who I was, the smart, funny, kind woman he'd fallen in love with. But then his voice hardened. He asked if his mother had really tried to make me sign that prenup. I confirmed it, told him I'd signed it just to prove I could, just to show them their intimidation tactics didn't work on me. And then I'd ripped it up. Drew laughed, a real, genuine laugh that I felt in my chest. He said I was amazing, and that his mother deserved every second of what I'd done to her. Then he asked if I was angry that he hadn't known, if I felt like he'd betrayed me by not protecting me from his family. I told him the truth. I was angry at his mother for treating me like garbage. As for the rest, I was grateful he'd given me the space to keep my privacy. It meant more than he could imagine. But what Drew didn't know, what I didn't tell him on that phone call, was that Victoria's humiliation wouldn't end with that afternoon in her living room. Because 2 days later, I got a call from my father. Chen David didn't call me often. He was busy running a global empire, and we had an understanding. I lived my life, he lived his, and we came together for holidays and board meetings. His voice was formal when he asked if I'd had an interaction with a Victoria Ashford recently. My stomach dropped. I asked how he knew. Turns out Victoria had done something spectacularly stupid. In her panic and embarrassment, she'd tried to verify my claims by calling Chen Global's corporate offices directly. She'd managed to get through to someone in investor relations and had started asking questions about me, about my stake in the company, about whether the numbers I'd shown her were real. The investor relations team, properly trained in privacy protocols, had refused to confirm or deny anything, but they'd flagged the call as a potential security issue and reported it up the chain, all the way up. To my father. My father told me he'd had Victoria's number traced, her identity confirmed, and a full background check run on the Ashford family within 2 hours. He knew about Drew. He knew about the engagement. He knew about their real estate company, their net worth, their social circle. He asked me, in that quiet way that meant he was furious, why I hadn't told him I was getting married. I felt like I was 16 again, caught sneaking out. I explained that I wanted to handle it myself, that I didn't want the Chen family machinery involved in my personal life. There was a pause. Then my father said something that made my blood run cold. He told me Victoria Ashford had made a second call, this one to a friend of hers who sat on the board of a tech startup. She'd been asking questions about Chen Global's acquisition strategies, about whether we were approachable for partnerships, about how someone might get an introduction to the executive team. She was already scheming, already trying to figure out how to benefit from my family's connections. The woman who'd told me I was worthless, who'd demanded I sign away any claim to her family's modest fortune, was now trying to network her way into my family's billions. My father asked if I wanted him to intervene. His tone made it clear that intervene could mean anything from a polite warning to complete social and financial destruction. I told him no, that I'd handle Victoria myself, because I'd just realized something. Signing that prenup and revealing my wealth wasn't the end of this story. It was just the beginning. Victoria hadn't learned to respect me. She just learned I had something she wanted, and that made her more dangerous than ever. The wedding was 3 weeks away, and Victoria Ashford had transformed herself into the perfect mother-in-law. It was disturbing, honestly. The woman who'd sneered at my clothes and questioned my worth was now calling me twice a day with suggestions for the ceremony. She wanted to help with seating arrangements. She offered to cover the cost of the flowers. She insisted on throwing me a bridal shower that, in her words, would be absolutely unforgettable. I said yes to everything, smiled, played along, because I knew exactly what she was doing. The bridal shower was held at the Fairmont in San Francisco, in a private room overlooking the bay. Victoria had invited 60 women, her friends, Drew's cousins, women from her country club. People who'd never met me before but showed up because Victoria Ashford had asked them to. I wore a simple cream dress from Nordstrom. Nothing designer. Nothing that screamed money. I wanted to see what Victoria would do. She was playing the gracious hostess, floating around the room in a silk Chanel suit, laughing and touching people's arms like she was running for office. But I caught her watching me, calculating. Every time someone asked me a question, Victoria would lean in just slightly, like she was afraid I might say something she couldn't control. One of her friends, a woman named Patricia with too much Botox and a diamond tennis bracelet, asked me what I did for work. I could feel Victoria tense from across the room. I told Patricia I consulted for tech companies, helped them with business strategy and market positioning. All technically true. I just left out the part where those companies paid my family's firm 6 figures for my advice. Patricia seemed satisfied. Victoria relaxed. Then Patricia asked about my family, and I watched Victoria actually move closer, abandoning the conversation she'd been having to hover near us. I mentioned my parents lived in San Jose, that my father worked in tech, that I'd grown up pretty normally, nothing exciting. Victoria jumped in then, her voice too bright. She told Patricia that I came from a wonderful family, very accomplished, very respected in their field. She said it like she was proud, like she'd always thought this. I wanted to laugh, or scream. Instead, I smiled and thanked her for the kind words. But here's what Victoria didn't know. I'd been documenting everything. Every phone call where she asked careful questions about my father's company. Every casual mention of business opportunities she thought might interest the Chen family. Every time she dropped hints about George's real estate firm struggling with expansion capital. She thought she was being subtle. She wasn't. The moment that confirmed everything came during the shower games. We were playing some ridiculous trivia game about Drew and me, and someone asked what my dream honeymoon destination was. I said somewhere quiet. Maybe a small island in Greece. Just the 2 of us. Victoria laughed, that tinkling artificial laugh she used at parties. She suggested we should really consider doing something more memorable, perhaps invite some family friends to join us for part of the trip. She knew several couples who had vacation homes in Santorini and Mykonos, such influential people. It would be wonderful for Drew's career to strengthen those relationships. There it was. She wasn't even hiding it anymore. She wanted access. Not to me, to my family's network. She saw me as a door she could walk through into rooms she'd never been invited to before. I told her that sounded lovely, and I'd definitely think about it. I watched her eyes light up. After the shower, Victoria insisted on driving me home. She wanted to talk, she said. Just the 2 of us. We sat in her Mercedes in front of my apartment building, the one she'd once looked at with such disdain, and she turned to me with this earnest expression that I'm sure she'd practiced in the mirror. She apologized. Again. Said she'd been wrong about me. That she'd let fear and protectiveness cloud her judgment. That she hoped we could start fresh, build a real relationship. I told her I appreciated that. That family was important to me. Then she made her move. She mentioned so casually that George's company was looking for investors for a new development project in Palo Alto. Premium office spaces, right in the heart of Silicon Valley, the kind of project that tech companies loved. She wondered if perhaps my father's company might be interested in taking a look at the prospectus. My hands were folded in my lap, calm and still. But inside, I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. This woman had told me I was nothing, had tried to intimidate me into signing away any claim to her family's money. And now, 3 weeks later, she was asking me to help her husband get funding from my family's billion-dollar company. I told her I could mention it to my father, see if the investment team might be interested. Victoria's face lit up like Christmas morning. She squeezed my hand, thanked me profusely, told me I was going to be such a wonderful addition to their family. When I got inside my apartment, I sat on my couch in the dark for a long time. Drew called, asked how the shower went. I told him it was fine. Lots of champagne and uncomfortable questions about our future children. He laughed, then asked if his mother had behaved herself. I hesitated. This was it. I could tell him what was happening, that his mother was using our relationship to try to access my family's money and connections. That every kindness she showed me now was calculated. But I didn't. Because I'd realized something during that car ride with Victoria. She'd made a critical mistake, one that would give me exactly what I needed when the time came. She'd underestimated me twice. The first time she thought I was poor and powerless. The second time she thought I was rich and naive. Victoria Ashford had just handed me the weapon I needed to ensure she would never, ever try to use me again. I sent George's investment prospectus to my father's office the next day. Not because I wanted to help the Ashfords, because I needed to see exactly how desperate they were. My father's investment team was thorough, borderline ruthless actually. Within 48 hours, I had a full analysis sitting in my email inbox. 23 pages of financial breakdowns, market comparisons, and risk assessments that basically amounted to one conclusion. George Ashford's company was hemorrhaging money, and this Palo Alto development project was a last-ditch attempt to stay afloat. The numbers were worse than I'd imagined. The Ashford real estate firm had over-leveraged itself on 3 properties in the South Bay right before the market softened. They were carrying significant debt, their credit lines were nearly maxed out, and several of their major investors had quietly pulled out over the past 6 months. That $40 million valuation Victoria loved to brag about. More like $15 million in actual liquid assets, and most of that was tied up in properties they couldn't sell without taking massive losses. The Ashfords weren't just comfortable. They were drowning. And Victoria knew it. Suddenly, everything made sense. The aggressive prenup wasn't really about protecting their assets from me. It was about making sure I couldn't claim anything when their little empire collapsed. The timing of Drew's proposal, right when their financial troubles were starting to surface. The way Victoria had latched onto me the second she learned who I really was. I sat at my kitchen table, reading through the analysis for the 3rd time, feeling this cold clarity wash over me. Victoria hadn't just misjudged me because of classism or snobbery. She'd been scanning for threats, for anyone who might discover the truth about their finances. And now she thought she'd found her salvation in me. I called my father. Not his office line, his personal cell, the one only family used. He answered on the 2nd ring, his voice crisp and professional even though it was nearly 10 at night. I asked him if he'd seen the analysis on the Ashford investment opportunity. He confirmed he had. Then he asked me what I wanted him to do about it. That was my father. No judgment, no lecture. Just a simple question about what outcome I was looking for. I told him I needed to understand why Victoria had treated me the way she did, whether it was just about money or if there was something deeper. My father was quiet for a moment. Then he told me something that made my skin crawl. He said his team had done some additional research, the kind that goes beyond public financial records. Apparently, Victoria had a history. Before she married George, she'd been engaged to someone else, a man from a wealthy San Francisco family. That engagement had ended abruptly when the man's parents discovered Victoria had been systematically manipulating their son, positioning herself to gain control of family assets through a series of complex financial arrangements. The family had paid her to go away quietly. A settlement. Enough money that Victoria had been able to present herself as independently wealthy when she met George a few years later. George, according to my father's sources, had no idea. He thought his wife came from old money, that her sophistication and social connections were inherited, not purchased with hush money. Victoria Ashford was a professional. This wasn't her first attempt at marrying into wealth and securing her position. It was just the first time she'd been caught. I felt sick. Not because of what Victoria had done in her past. People make choices, and I wasn't going to judge someone's survival strategies. But because she'd looked at me, seen someone she could control and manipulate, and had tried to run the same playbook. She'd failed with me. So now she was trying a different approach, making me the ally who'd save her from her husband's failing business. My father asked again what I wanted him to do. His tone suggested he already had several options prepared, none of them pleasant for the Ashfords. I told him I needed time, that I'd let him know. But the truth was, I already knew what I was going to do. The wedding was 2 weeks away. Drew had no idea his parents were on the brink of financial collapse. He had no idea his mother had a history of targeting wealthy families. He definitely had no idea that his mother was currently trying to use our relationship to access my family's money. I could tell him everything right now. Show him the financial reports, the background check, all of it. Watch his world shatter as he realized the kind of woman his mother really was. Or I could wait. Let Victoria keep playing her game. Let her think she was winning. Because I'd found something in that financial analysis that Victoria didn't know I'd seen. A small detail buried in page 17, in a section about pending litigation. George's company was being sued by a group of investors who claimed they'd been misled about the financial health of a previous development project. The lawsuit alleged fraud, specifically that George and his partners had knowingly provided false information to secure investment funding. The case was still in early stages. George's lawyers were fighting to keep it quiet, settling behind closed doors. But if it went to trial, if those allegations became public, it wouldn't just destroy their business. It would destroy their entire social standing in their precious Atherton community. And according to the notes from my father's legal team, Victoria was listed as a co-signatory on several of the documents in question, which meant she wasn't just aware of the fraud, she was potentially complicit. I closed my laptop and stared out my kitchen window at the Oakland skyline. The fog was rolling in from the bay, swallowing the buildings one by one. Victoria thought she was playing me, thought she could turn on the charm, erase her earlier cruelty with some fake apologies and manufactured warmth, and I'd just hand over access to billions of dollars in family resources. But she'd made a crucial miscalculation. She thought I was like her. Someone who'd do anything for money and status. Someone who'd overlook fraud and manipulation for the sake of family harmony. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. Victoria invited me to lunch at her country club 3 days before the wedding. She wanted to go over some last-minute details, she said. Make sure everything was perfect for my special day. Her voice on the phone was syrupy sweet, and I could practically hear the calculation behind every word. I accepted, told her I'd love to see her. The club was everything you'd expect. Manicured lawns, white tablecloths, staff who called everyone by name. Victoria was already seated at a table on the terrace when I arrived, wearing Hermes and pearls like armor. She stood to hug me, and I let her. Felt her bony shoulders under the expensive silk, smelled her Chanel No. 5, and smiled like this was all perfectly normal. We ordered salads neither of us would finish, and made small talk about flower arrangements, and whether the string quartet I'd chosen was classical enough. Victoria kept steering the conversation back to my family, asking careful questions about my father's business travel schedule, whether he'd be bringing any colleagues to the wedding, how large his team was. I gave her just enough to keep her interested. Mentioned that my father would be bringing several executives from the company, that a few board members would be attending, that it would actually be quite the gathering of Chen Global leadership, since family events were rare and people wanted to show their support. Victoria's eyes lit up. She started talking about the seating arrangements, suggesting that perhaps George should be seated near some of my father's colleagues. For conversation, she said. George was so interested in the tech industry, and it would be wonderful for him to make those connections. I told her that sounded fine, watched her practically vibrate with excitement. Then she made her crucial mistake. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something conspiratorial and intimate. She told me she was so grateful that we'd moved past that unfortunate misunderstanding with the prenup, that she hoped I understood she'd only been trying to protect Drew, that she could see now what a remarkable young woman I was, and how lucky their family was to have me joining them. She said all of this while reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, and I felt the weight of her rings, the 2-carat diamond, the sapphire band, all the symbols of the wealth and status she was desperately trying to maintain. Then she mentioned, so casually, that George had been telling her about some of the challenges in commercial real estate lately. How competitive the market was. How difficult it could be to secure the right kind of investment partners who really understood the vision. She said she knew it was terribly forward of her to bring up business at lunch, but she wondered if I might have had a chance to mention George's project to my father, if there'd been any interest from the Chen Global Investment team. I set down my water glass very carefully, looked at this woman who'd humiliated me, dismissed me, tried to intimidate me into signing away any claim to her family's modest fortune, and was now asking me to funnel her husband millions of dollars from my family's company. I told her I had mentioned it to my father, that his team had reviewed the proposal thoroughly. Victoria's face transformed, pure relief and triumph flooding her features. She started thanking me, telling me she knew I'd come through, that she'd told George I was the kind of person who understood family loyalty. I let her finish, let her bask in what she thought was victory. Then I told her the investment team had declined, that after careful analysis, they didn't feel the project aligned with Chen Global's investment strategy. The color drained from Victoria's face. She tried to recover, laughing nervously and saying that was perfectly fine, completely understandable. But her hand shook slightly as she reached for her wine glass. I wasn't done. I mentioned very gently that my father's team had been quite thorough in their analysis, that they'd looked at not just the current project, but at George's company's overall financial health and history, that they'd found some concerning patterns in how previous developments had been structured and financed. Victoria went very still, the kind of stillness that meant she knew exactly what I was talking about. I told her I was sure it was nothing, just some pending litigation that would probably settle quietly. These things happened in real estate all the time. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw real fear there. Not embarrassment, not humiliation. Fear. Because she understood in that moment that I knew everything. The financial troubles, the fraud allegations, her history of targeting wealthy families. All of it. I smiled at her, took a sip of my water, told her I was so glad we could have this lunch, just the two of us, before the wedding. That it was important to me that we understood each other completely. Victoria managed to nod. Her voice came out thin and strained when she said she was glad too. I left her sitting at that table on the country club terrace, surrounded by her wealthy friends and her carefully constructed life, knowing that I now held every card that mattered. That night, I got a call from Drew. He sounded concerned. He said his mother had seemed upset after their lunch, and he wanted to make sure everything was okay between us. I told him everything was fine, that we'd just been discussing wedding details, and Victoria was probably just emotional about her son getting married. It was sweet how much she cared, I said. Drew relaxed, told me he loved me, said he couldn't wait for Saturday, when I'd officially be part of his family. I told him I loved him too, and I meant it. But what I didn't tell him was that I'd spent the afternoon after lunch with Victoria doing something else, something that would ensure the Ashford family could never, ever use me or my family again. I'd called my father back, told him I was ready to make my decision about the Ashfords, and I'd asked him to arrange something very specific for the wedding reception. because I'd realized that Victoria and George needed to learn the same lesson Victoria had tried to teach me with that prenup. Actions have consequences. And sometimes, those consequences come wrapped in silk and delivered with a smile at the most important social event of your life. The wedding was in 3 days. Victoria thought she'd weathered the storm, that she could still salvage something from this relationship with me even if the investment hadn't worked out. She had no idea what was coming. The wedding was perfect. I'm not being sarcastic. The venue was stunning. A historic mansion in Woodside with gardens that overlooked the bay. The flowers were exactly what I'd wanted. White roses and eucalyptus, simple and elegant. Drew looked incredible in his tux, and when I walked down the aisle, the way he looked at me made everything else disappear for a moment. We said our vows, we kissed. Everyone applauded. It was everything a wedding should be. Victoria cried during the ceremony. Real tears this time, I think. She dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief and smiled at me like I was the daughter she'd always wanted. George stood beside her looking proud and relieved, probably thinking his son had just married into the solution to all their problems. The reception was held in the mansion's ballroom. 200 guests, crystal chandeliers, a 10-piece band. Victoria had insisted on reviewing the seating chart 3 times, making sure George was positioned near my father's executives, maximizing his networking opportunities. I'd let her. It didn't matter anymore. Dinner was served. People gave toasts. Drew's best friend told embarrassing stories from college. My maid of honor made everyone laugh with tales of my terrible cooking. The room was warm and full of joy, exactly how a wedding reception should feel. Then my father stood up. Chen David didn't give speeches often. When he did, people listened. The room went quiet immediately, all 200 guests turning their attention to the tall, distinguished man at the head table. He started by welcoming everyone, thanked them for celebrating this important day with our families, talked about love and partnership and the bonds that hold us together. Then he shifted tone. He said that marriage was built on trust and honesty, that without those foundations, even the strongest relationships would crumble. He looked directly at Drew and me when he said this, and I felt my husband squeeze my hand under the table. My father continued. He said that in his many years building and running Chen Global, he'd learned that character mattered more than wealth, that integrity couldn't be bought or faked, that the people you chose to surround yourself with defined who you became. I could see Victoria across the room, smiling and nodding along. She thought this was a generic speech about family values. She had no idea what was coming. My father said he was grateful that his daughter had found someone like Drew, someone with genuine kindness and strong moral character, someone who'd been raised to value honesty and hard work. Then he paused. The silence stretched just long enough to make people shift in their seats. He said it was unfortunate that not everyone in Drew's family shared those same values. Victoria's smile froze. My father gestured to someone at the back of the room. The doors opened, and 3 people walked in. 2 men in suits and a woman carrying a folder. I recognized them, members of Chen Global's legal team. My father explained, in that calm and measured voice that made him so effective in boardrooms, that Chen Global took ethics very seriously. That before making any business partnership or family alliance, they conducted thorough due diligence. It was standard practice, he said. Nothing personal. The legal team had reached the head table. One of the men handed my father the folder. My father opened it, started reading. He detailed the findings of the investigation into George Ashford's real estate company, the over-leveraged properties, the maxed-out credit lines, the investors who'd been quietly pulling out for months. He presented each fact calmly, like he was delivering a quarterly earnings report. George had gone pale. Victoria was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. But my father wasn't done. He moved on to the lawsuit, read excerpts from the allegations, how investors had been provided falsified financial projections, how George and his partners had knowingly misrepresented the viability of previous development projects, how documents had been altered to hide the true financial risk. The room was dead silent, I could hear someone's fork clatter against a plate in the back. Then my father mentioned Victoria's name, explained that she'd co-signed several of the documents in question, that according to the evidence gathered by the plaintiff's attorneys, she'd been aware of and participated in the misrepresentations. Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She tried to say something, but no words came out. My father looked at her. His expression wasn't angry. It was worse. It was disappointed. He said that when Victoria had attempted to leverage her new connection to the Chen family to secure investment funding for her husband's failing company, she'd made a critical error. She'd assumed that money and social status could overcome ethical concerns, that the Chen family would overlook fraud and deception for the sake of family harmony. I watched Victoria's face crumble, not with sadness, with pure humiliation and rage. My father closed the folder. He said that Chen Global would not be investing in any Ashford enterprises. That furthermore, the company would be sharing their findings with the appropriate authorities and with the other investors involved in the pending litigation. Then he turned to Drew and me. His expression softened completely. He said that none of this reflected on Drew, that my husband was not responsible for his parents' choices, that the Chen family welcomed him with open arms and looked forward to many happy years together. He raised his glass, made a toast to love, honesty, and new beginnings. Everyone drank. The room slowly came back to life with uncertain applause. Drew was staring at his parents. His face had gone through shock, confusion, and was now settling into something like betrayal. He stood up, walked over to their table, and I watched him lean down to say something to his father. George couldn't meet his eyes. Victoria tried to approach me. She was crying now, real tears finally, and trying to push through the guests who'd formed an unconscious barrier around our table. I stayed seated, kept my hand in Drew's empty chair, watched her come toward me like a storm that had already lost its power. She reached our table, mascara running down her cheeks, and tried to explain. Tried to say it was all a misunderstanding, that my father had the wrong information, that she'd never meant to deceive anyone. I looked at this woman who'd told me I was nothing, who'd tried to intimidate me with legal documents and social superiority, who'd thought she could use my love for her son to exploit my family's wealth. I told her I knew exactly who she was, that I'd known since before the wedding, that every smile, every apology, every attempt at bonding had been transparent from the moment I'd discovered the truth about the Ashford family finances. Victoria's face twisted. The mask finally came off completely. She said I'd destroyed her, that I'd deliberately humiliated her in front of everyone who mattered, that I was vindictive and cruel and had manipulated this entire situation. I stood up then, looked down at her from my full height in my wedding heels. I told her she'd destroyed herself, that I'd simply stopped pretending I didn't see what she was doing, that the humiliation she felt right now was nothing compared to what she'd tried to make me feel in her living room when she demanded I sign that prenup. Then I said the thing I'd been holding back for weeks. I told her that the difference between us was simple. I had power because I'd earned it, because my family had built something valuable over generations through hard work and integrity. She'd tried to take power by manipulating and deceiving people, and that approach only worked until someone called her bluff. Security was moving toward us now. The venue staff had clearly decided Victoria needed to be escorted out. She looked at me one last time. Her voice came out as a hiss when she said I'd regret this, that I'd made an enemy, that she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. I smiled at her, told her to go ahead and try, that I'd be fascinated to see who'd believe her version of events versus the one backed by legal documents and financial records. They let her out. George followed, hunched and silent. I watched them leave through the ballroom doors, their expensive clothes and jewelry suddenly looking like costumes on actors who'd forgotten their lines. Drew came back to the table, sat down heavily in his chair. His hand found mine, and I felt him trembling. He asked me why I hadn't told him. why I'd let him walk into this blind. I turned to face him fully. Told him the truth, that his parents' problems weren't his burden to carry, that I'd wanted him to have one perfect day before he had to deal with the reality of what his family had become, that I loved him enough to shield him from this for as long as I could. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if I'd orchestrated the whole thing, the investigation, the public revelation, all of it. I told him I'd simply told my father the truth about what had happened, that he'd taken it from there, because that's what the Chen family did. They protected their own, and they didn't tolerate deception. Drew nodded slowly. Then he squeezed my hand and said he was grateful, that he would have wanted to protect his parents, to make excuses for them, if he'd known beforehand, that this way he couldn't pretend anymore. He had to face what they'd done. The band started playing again, our first dance as a married couple. Drew stood, offered me his hand, and we walked onto the dance floor while 200 people watched us with a mixture of sympathy and fascination. We danced, and I felt the weight of the last few weeks finally lift off my shoulders. Victoria Ashford had tried to make me sign away my dignity and my rights. She'd tried to use my love for her son to exploit my family's resources. She'd underestimated me twice, and had paid for it both times. But as Drew held me and we swayed to the music, I realized something important. This had never really been about Victoria. It had been about drawing a line, about showing anyone who might look at me and see someone they could manipulate that I was not the one. The Ashfords would face consequences now, legal ones, social ones, financial ones. But those were their choices coming home to roost, not my revenge. I'd simply stopped playing along with their fiction. 3 months after the wedding, Drew and I moved into a house in Palo Alto. Not a mansion, not some sprawling estate meant to prove anything to anyone. Just a comfortable 4-bedroom craftsman with a yard and good light, close enough to Drew's office that he could bike to work. We paid for it together. Half from his savings, half from mine. He insisted on it, even though I could have bought the house outright without noticing the money. That was one of the things I loved most about him. He needed to contribute, to build something that was ours, not just mine. Victoria and George lost their house in Atherton. The lawsuit went public after my father's legal team shared their findings with the plaintiff's attorneys, and 3 other investor groups came forward with similar complaints. The company declared bankruptcy within 6 weeks. George took a plea deal. Fraud, securities violations, misrepresentation. He got 18 months in a minimum security facility and a lifetime ban from serving as an officer in any real estate company. Victoria, because she'd cooperated with investigators, avoided jail time, but paid significant fines and restitution. They moved to a rental apartment in San Mateo. 2 bedrooms, no view. Drew struggled with it. I'd watch him staring at his phone, reading news articles about his parents' fall from grace, his jaw tight and his eyes distant. He'd grown up believing his family stood for something, that the Ashford name meant integrity and success. Learning it was all built on lies and manipulation had broken something in him that I couldn't fix, no matter how much I wanted to. We had long conversations, late-night talks where he tried to reconcile the parents he thought he knew with the people who'd committed fraud and tried to exploit my family's money. I listened, held him when he needed it, gave him space when he asked for it. But I didn't let him blame himself. That was important. One night, about 2 months after the wedding, Drew asked me if I regretted how everything had happened. If I wished I'd handled it differently, maybe quietly instead of exposing everything so publicly. I thought about it carefully before answering. Told him that my only regret was that he'd been hurt in the process. That I'd never wanted him to lose his family, even if that family had been built on foundations he hadn't known were rotten. But no, I didn't regret exposing the truth. Because silence protected predators, it let people like Victoria continue manipulating and deceiving, finding new victims who didn't have the resources to fight back. Drew nodded, said he understood. Then he told me something I hadn't expected. He said watching me handle his mother had taught him something crucial about strength, That real power wasn't about intimidation or control. It was about having the courage to say no, to draw boundaries, to refuse to be diminished by people who thought they were entitled to diminish you. That his mother had spent her whole life taking power from others because she couldn't generate it herself. But I'd never needed to take anything from anyone. I just stood in my own power and refused to be moved. I cried when he said that. Not sad tears, grateful ones. Because he got it. He understood that this had never been about revenge or cruelty. It had been about refusing to be a victim. Victoria tried to contact me twice in those first few months. Once through email, a long message about how I'd destroyed their lives and ruined their reputation, and did I feel proud of myself now? I deleted it without responding. The second time was a handwritten letter that arrived at our house. She'd written 6 pages about how she'd only been trying to protect her son, how the fraud charges were exaggerated, how if I had any decency I'd help them with legal fees. I showed the letter to Drew, asked him what he wanted me to do. He read it slowly. Then he put it in the fireplace and lit it with a match. We watched it burn together. George never contacted us at all. Drew heard through a cousin that his father was ashamed, that he couldn't face his son after everything that had been revealed. Drew tried calling a few times, but George never answered. Eventually, Drew stopped trying, said he needed to build his own life, his own reputation, separate from whatever the Ashford name meant now. I helped where I could. Not with money. Drew wouldn't have accepted that. But with advice. With connections to people who could mentor him in his career. With the confidence that comes from knowing your partner believes in you completely. He thrived, got promoted. Started building a name for himself in venture capital that had nothing to do with his family background and everything to do with his instincts and his integrity. 6 months after the wedding, we found out I was pregnant. Drew was terrified and ecstatic in equal measure. He kept saying he didn't know how to be a father, that he didn't have a good model to follow. I reminded him that he'd already chosen to be different from his parents, that awareness was half the battle. We decided not to tell Victoria and George about the pregnancy. Not out of cruelty, but because we both knew that child needed to be protected from the toxicity that still lived in that relationship. Maybe someday, Drew said, when the baby was older, when his parents had proven they'd actually changed, not just learned to hide better. I told him I'd support whatever he decided. My father threw us a baby shower. Small, intimate, just close family and friends. He gave a toast where he talked about legacy, not the kind built on money or companies, but the kind built on values and choices, about how the greatest wealth anyone could pass to the next generation was integrity. I thought about Victoria during that toast. About how she'd spent her entire life chasing status and money, building power through manipulation and deception, and how, in the end, she'd lost everything, because she'd never understood that true security doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from being someone people can trust. The baby is due in 3 months. We're having a girl. Drew wants to name her after my grandmother, who passed away when I was young. A woman who'd come to America with nothing, worked beside my grandfather to build Chen Global from the ground up, and who'd taught me that strength and grace weren't opposites. They were partners. I think about what I'll tell our daughter someday, about her grandmother Victoria, about what happened at our wedding, about why some families have complicated relationships. I'll tell her the truth, that people make choices, and those choices have consequences. That nobody gets to diminish you unless you let them. That money and status are tools, not identities. That the only power worth having is the kind you earn through being someone worth trusting. I'll tell her that her father comes from a family that made terrible mistakes, but that he chose to be different. That he chose integrity over comfort, truth over convenience. That he's proof that we're not bound by where we come from, only by who we choose to become. And I'll tell her about the day I signed that prenup in Victoria's living room, about how I sat there and let that woman think she'd won, because I knew something she didn't. You can't intimidate someone who knows their own worth. That moment, sitting at that coffee table, signing those papers, knowing I held all the power even as Victoria gloated. That was the moment I truly understood what my grandfather had tried to teach me all those years ago. Wealth isn't about money. It's about knowing exactly who you are, and never letting anyone convince you to be less than that. Victoria Ashford saw a young woman in cheap clothes driving an old car and thought she'd found an easy target. Someone she could control and manipulate and eventually discard when she'd served her purpose. She never imagined that young woman could buy and sell her entire world without blinking. But more importantly, she never imagined that young woman wouldn't need to. That simply standing firm in her own truth would be enough to bring Victoria's entire house of cards tumbling down. I drive past their old house in Atherton sometimes, on my way to visit friends in the area. There's a new family living there now, tech entrepreneurs who made their money in clean energy. The gardens look different. The whole place has a lighter feeling to it, like it's been freed from something heavy. I don't feel triumphant when I see it. I don't feel vindicated or proud. I just feel free from the expectation that I should make myself smaller to make others comfortable. Free from the belief that family loyalty means accepting mistreatment. Free from the fear that speaking truth will make me the villain in someone else's story. Drew and I are building something different. A family based on honesty and respect, and the understanding that love doesn't mean accepting everything. Sometimes it means drawing boundaries and holding them firm. Our daughter will grow up knowing her mother stood up for herself. That when faced with intimidation and manipulation, she didn't back down or retaliate with cruelty. She simply refused to play a game designed to make her lose. That's the real victory. Not the public revelation at the wedding. Not Victoria's fall from grace. Not even the security of knowing my family's wealth will always protect me. The victory is knowing that I could have been destroyed by someone like Victoria if I hadn't trusted myself. If I'd believed her when she said I was nothing. If I'd signed that prenup and accepted her version of my worth. But I didn't. And that choice, to stand firm in my own power, made all the difference. So if you're reading this, if you're listening to my story and wondering what the point is, here it is. You teach people how to treat you. And sometimes teaching that lesson means letting them underestimate you completely, and then showing them exactly who they're dealing with. Victoria wanted me to sign that prenup or leave. I signed it. Then I showed her exactly what she'd missed, not just my family's company name, but my refusal to be diminished by her games. And that refusal? That's the kind of power no prenup can ever protect against. Before I go, I want to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story from? What city? What corner of the world? Drop a comment and let me know. I love knowing there are people out there who understand what it means to stand up for yourself when everything seems stacked against you. And if you want to hear more stories like this, about people who refused to be victims, who stood firm when they were supposed to break, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Because there are so many of us out there, so many stories that need to be told. Thank you for being here, for listening, for understanding that sometimes the best revenge is just being too strong to break.